Good day, students. Your professor here to talk about week 2 of reading the New Testament. Here you'll see your objectives for this week. Summarize the interpretive relationship between the Old and New Testament. This is a fun one and very important. Much of you, hopefully all of you, had something of the scales pulled off of your eyes as you did a study of the Old Testament during the first during your previous course of reading Old Testament. But what you're going to see now is how there's a relationship between the Old and New Testament. These aren't two completely separate entities. The New Testament fulfills the Old Testament, and you're going to start to see the interpretive relationship between the two. Secondly, this week you will explain how the New Testament builds upon and incorporates what came before it. And finally, suggest guidelines for interpreting the Old Testament in light of the New. This first paper for this week, assignment 2.1, is going to do that in essentially 2 to 3 pages. Suggest guidelines. So there's not actually going to be any specific worksheet or bullet points that you have to address. It is simply this. It's a paper. 2 to 3 pages, Times New Roman, 12 font. Don't mess with the margins, people. I don't like it when that happens. It looks like you're cheating. And 2 to 3 pages, double spaced. Okay, 12-point font, Times New Roman. Suggest guidelines or principles that the New Testament readers should apply when interpreting the Old Testament narratives in light of the New Testament. So, looking at your reading this week down here, you're just going to find some guidelines or principles that the New Testament readers should apply when interpreting the Old Testament narratives. So we're not going to be talking about the prophetic, poetic, the narratives. So, obviously Genesis and Exodus have a lot of narrative, but your reading this week is going to address that. But you're going to look at when you're interpreting Old Testament narratives in light of now what has happened in the New Testament. How does that influence it? We do want to see you organize the paper so that each principle is discussed per paragraph. So you're going to have multiple concepts, so 3 to 5 to make up your paragraph, 3 to 5 main concepts. And so each big paragraph will be about that concept. You can title them if you want, but the point is you're going to address 3 to 5 concepts in total, and each of these big chunky paragraphs will be a concept that you'll talk about that will essentially be these principles or guidelines that New Testament readers should apply when interpreting the Old in light of the New. Okay? In those paragraphs, you're essentially going to talk about why they what they are and why they matter. All right? It's simple, but feel free to let me know if you have questions. And that's it. That's the paper. Okay. Assignment 2.2. Interview. Interactive assignment. What you're going to do is you're going to interview a pastor about their view of the Sabbath. Why are we going to interview a pastor? Because pastors don't want to really write. This doesn't need to be a formal sit down. This can be something where, hey, I need to talk to you on the phone for 5 minutes. I need to grab you at church for a few minutes after Wednesday night or Sunday service or something like that. Or can you get back to me an email this week? It needs to be done this week. Ideally, if you got a relationship with your lead pastor, wonderful, or any other pastor of the church. If you absolutely cannot find a pastor, find someone who is been to seminary. And if it's not your lead pastor, well, first of all, I want you to title in this assignment who the person was, and if they're not if they're your pastor, tell them what church it is and what their role is. If it's not your pastor and it's maybe another pastor, you'd say that. If it's someone who's not necessarily a pastor but is seminary trained or theologically trained, explain that. But ideally, this should be the pastor of your church, okay? And the interview is simply this, asking about their view of the Sabbath. This can be done via email if need be. Ask whether or not they believe the commandment is still binding, and if so, why? So, the command to keep the Sabbath, make it holy, is that still binding? And do we need to do obviously none of them believe that what the Jewish audience did on the Sabbath and the way they treated Sabbath, where certainly I mean they don't even cook, let alone all the other things that are done on the Sabbath. So, but in essence, the commandment of keeping the Sabbath and making it holy, is it binding, and if so, why? In a half page or less, summarize the pastor's perspective and how that reflects his reading of the Old and New Testament. So what we're going to do in this very simple exercise is expose, okay, if it's binding, okay, in what way is it binding? You'll probably have some that say yes, you'll probably have some that say no, but I'm guessing all of them will still not keep the Sabbath in the same way it was kept for much of the audience of the Old Testament. How is that? Why is that? And a lot of that has to do with how the New Testament reflects back on how we read the Old Testament. So that's why this is an excellent exercise, right? So how we treat the Sabbath now is different in many ways, but in varying ways, based on how we view and read the Old Testament through the lens of the New Testament and what has happened. Include a brief statement about whether or not you agree then with your pastor. So the big bulk of this assignment is essentially explaining what their view is on this. Then you just need to do a quick statement about whether you agree with this or what. Give me more than yes or no. Give me why you agree or why you disagree with them in any way. Okay? That should be a fun one. So enjoy that one. And then your second discussion board this week, read Galatians 4. Then based on this reading of Galatians 4, how would you describe Paul's use of the Old Testament? Galatians 4 specifically is Paul tapping in on his Old Testament knowledge and how he's applying it through the lens of Christ? Did Paul have more liberty than we do when interpreting the Old Testament? Meaning, okay, he's the Apostle Paul, so obviously nothing, because we already believe that what he writes is Scripture and it's authoritative. It's the words of God, in some way. When Paul wrote this, did he have more liberty in interpreting the Old Testament than you and I do? Meaning, is he able to take things of the Old Testament and do different things with it than we're allowed to do with it because he was an apostle and Bible writer? What do you do with that question? If so, why? If not, why not? Okay. This should be fascinating discussion as well. So we're gonna have you discover an example of how Paul is using the Old Testament, and then secondly, discuss the concept of whether he actually, as his role as an apostle, has more liberty to interpret the Old Testament in ways that you and I don't. Or is it potentially that he is able to see things that we can't? How does that work? Discuss and have some fun. And I will see you on the flip side. Let me know if you have questions. Much love and blessing to you all. Goodbye.